The other question relating to that is like, is there actually a benefit to permissionlessness in that context? And I think there is, in terms of reducing overhead. Like you can have companies with directors from all over the world and stuff. It's just legally very complicated. And the legal structure is very poorly set up for that. It's very poorly set up to even employ people globally. And so if that was streamlined to work better in a more globalized world, then I don't think you would actually lose out on much of the benefits of permissionlessness, even if it wasn't, even if it was sort of a formal legal structure that then also allowed you to like have a bank account and stuff. Here we go. We're live again. Or trying this time. But we're trying to, right? Yeah, we had a lost episode. We now have a big video file where we have only me speaking and then strange gaps between me saying things.
Yeah, this is what happens when you give a couple plebs like us recording software meant for actual professionals that were like, oh yeah, producer sounds nice. I'm gonna go come in as a producer. So, yeah.
What are you gonna do? Yeah.
So we have had now an episode that we didn't record. We have an episode 0. We were supposed to have an episode 8, which is the Teemu Soliloquy now. So that's like the lost episode. We have a lost episode now. And now this one, which is probably going to be proper episode 8.
Yeah. So we switched to moving the software called Riverside, which supposedly it just gives us a little bit more ability to do things. And it turns out that the moment we get more complicated software in our hands that allows us to do more things, we start fucking more things up. So that's basically what happens.
Which is perfectly apparent for the course for a crypto, by and large, crypto focused podcast, right? You just give people more tools and they just fuck things up in different new ways.
Indeed. And so we have a lot to talk about. We can rehash some of the things we talked about on the lost episode, because there were a lot of things that went or that happened around then. But maybe we start with the new MakerDAO stuff that's been going on. So MakerDAO recently accepted the proposal, or I guess it's Rune's proposal, basically, to move to this sort of meta DAO format, which, is not very descriptive, but the general idea is to split Maker into a number of smaller DAOs. And maybe as a quick comment on that before I ask you for your take, I do think that sort of structurally makes more sense, right? Like you do need to have like small groups of people with relatively independent decision-making ability on some things. I think the biggest issue with DAOs is this assumption that everyone would always vote, and that never actually happens, right? So then nothing gets done. And so to move faster, you do need to split into smaller groups, but there's a lot of questions around, like, 'cause the plan, as far as I know, with the MetaDAOs is that they'll have like their own tokens, and then like somehow will be funded by like something. I don't know. It just all feels very confusing. But what do you think?
Oh God. Okay, a lot of stuff that you said I don't want to go over. So for starters, is are small teams, small, very focused, independent teams the right way to go? I would say 100%. Generally, I tend to prefer small teams than sprawling, gigantic things. So I'm all for that. Now, the issue is that, as you mentioned, is not just like, oh, let's have small focus teams that get to decide within this area of expertise. But it is just basically, it wants to turn Maker into this sort of like loosely aligned corporation of DAOs thing. And as you mentioned, everything with their own token and whatnot. And on top of that, is not even doing it supposedly for performance, is doing this just in theory because of censorship resistance. Like the tiny groups get to operate independently, no matter what happens with the big one. Never mind is that they're funded with the big one that is going to be keeping its funds at Coinbase, right? So how censorship resistant are we going to be with this whole gigantic structure that we just brought on? So anyway, that is one issue.
I mean, it is very strange that they're kind of going for this maximum decentralization strategy while voluntarily giving or like putting more of their money into US treasuries via Coinbase or Gemini or whichever one of these.
And let's not fuck around. How decentralized is this thing really going to be? I mean, if let's assume that the teams are actually independent, right? They're still funded by the main thing. And if you see how the end game
you cut off there. I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, no, I was saying that never mind if the structure makes sense or not, right? In theory, this is make them more independent, but they're still supposedly going to be funded in some way by the main maker, and they're all pushing towards that, which means that whomever controls maker is going to have a big say on these things. And, the vote was 74% direct rune control, 6% people affiliated with Rune. So it was 80% Rune, pretty much. That what exact vote independence or decentralization are we getting here exactly? So it's frankly, this is all theater. It's Kansas theater.
Are you saying that 76% was just Rune? No, surely not.
From the analysis that I saw, which I can send you the link so we can post it, that Hasu quoted, actually it's on the thread that I have sent you. It was about 74% yes on the Rune's direct economic influence, 6% of other yes votes, and 20% no.
Okay.
So,
and
much decentralization.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of commentary around this happening regarding like this also being kind of a signal or a step in terms of Rune taking back control in a way. But the question I have is, did he ever actually lose control? if that's the case?
It's evidently not, but hey man, people get bored and they start playing DAO games.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I can imagine that from the perspective of Andreessen Horowitz, they would prefer not going dark and trying to become the sort of stable coin for the whole global economy, which would make sense.
You sure? Why would they have an economic interest in that? That's crazy.
Yeah, but there are a lot of questions around like, how do you kind of bring a maker into the light, kind of? Because the current configuration is one which it is difficult to sort of transition into. Like if we assume sort of pretty heavy regulations around what you can and can't do, it would be difficult to transition into that, I think. But AAVE is doing it in some ways. They're creating kind of permissioned pools with KYC stuff for institutional clients. I'm not sure what the equivalent of that would be for Maker, but it's not impossible, I don't think. And I kind of like the idea that the AAVE strategy is pretty good. They're like, we're going to have this permissionless thing, but then we're going to do this permission thing for institutions. And so you kind of keep both things alive without really sacrificing much of anything. And it seems like that would be one way, or that's kind of a clever way of doing it, because you appease governments and stuff quite a lot by having this sort of alternative path. And then you can always argue like, look, that, like if you're in a specific jurisdiction that requires a specific thing, then use this permission pool that's set up for your jurisdiction, right? And then everybody else can use this. For Maker, though, I could only imagine that would require fragmenting DAI, though. you would need to have like two DAIs, a regulated DAI and a unregulated DAI. Maybe not.
And regulated where?
Well, that's the thing, right? You make you give it out as like as software package. People can implement whatever regulations they wish.
So like a bring your own DAI kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, kind of, right? Like you can like roll your own in a way. And it's not necessarily even the worst idea. Like if you had these regulated versions of DAI, I guess the regulations would apply primarily to the sort of CDP owners or holders of DAI. I'm not sure.
Maybe because if say the EU were to apply regulations on stable coins, like they have on algorithmic stable coins, like they have threatened, and DAI is arguably an algorithmic stable coin, then maybe you couldn't even use DAI in the European Union, right? Which it's one of the two key differences between DAI and AAVE, which make it an AAVE for me. The first one is that AAVE is useful by and large by itself for you. So you only need, if you want a loan or you need to borrow money, you only need enough demand or liquidity in a particular pool in order to get it. You do not need the AAVE to be widely accepted because what you're getting out of there is USDC or Ether or what have you, right? Whereas for DAI, DAI is supposed to be a currency. You need DAI to be widely accepted for DAI to be useful for you. If the EU decides that DAI doesn't look like something that they want eDAI, and you're holding this other thing, then why do you want this? So that's one of the differences why AAVE has an easier time doing this. It is very much just about the pool, and people who are in a pool don't need to worry about anything else. The second factor is that I think AAVE is going at this in a very reasonable manner when it comes to how they're building it. From what I understand, like I forget what the name is for the AAVE company, but there is an AAVE Labs. I think it is. There is an AAVE Labs that operates as a traditional business or whatever, and they do work and then petition the DAO for back payment for the work, from what I have seen. So it is not that AAVE Labs is a DAO. AAVE Labs doesn't need to go to a bunch of online randos and ask them, do you want us to do this thing? It is more about, hey, we built this thing. Do you want to use it? And do you want to pay us for it? And given that AAVE Labs is by and large the main developer, then, what are you going to say? Like, no, I don't really like development on my platform. So I think that Maker basically has the worst side on both of these cases.
But they do have the Maker Foundation. Is that somehow distinctly different from AAVE Labs in your mind?
It is for me because AAVE Labs, as far as I know, the foundations need to have explicitly a non-profit goal of furthering something, right? And they need to operate by violence, etc. It can't just be a CEO showing up and saying, this is the thing we should be building. Which AAVE Labs does get to do, right? If AAVE Labs wants to pursue Lens for whatever reason, that's their thing. If Maker, right. if I have a foundation whose stated purpose is to further this particular platform, I don't get to go pursue something else. So from a business standpoint, I do think it's a different thing. Second, foundations are a lot more restricted on what they get to do and how they get to spend their money, which I expect also changes the equation. The foundations, to me, are there mostly as a feeble attempt at a legal shield more than as an actual business structure.
I mean, foundations can definitely make money. It just doesn't go to shareholders like in a company. But it's probably true. I wonder, is there any benefit to having an algorithmic stablecoin that is permissioned? So what I'm asking is like,
only some people get to come into the pools or through them.
yeah, or hold it or whatever. But basically, like, if decentralized stable coins are banned or whatever, like not allowed, and made it very difficult to operate, the question then becomes like, is the only reasonable model the circle model, or is there some kind of more protocol like model that still makes sense in an environment where they're more restricted and have to be kind of fragmented by jurisdiction to some degree?
The problem is not necessarily the permission part in there, I think. It's not about who gets to, and again, depends permission at what stage, right? Because there are several levels of permission when it comes to USDC. There's who gets to mint and who gets to burn. And then there is the fact that there is a kill switch for wallets. So if we're talking about permission on the who gets to mint and who gets to burn side, then I would not see that as a problem as a permissioned problem, let's say for algorithmic stablecoin. If it is, hey, I'm going to be putting money into this pool, which is supposed to back this thing, but we only take KYC people's money into that pool for whatever reason. We only take banks into that pool. I don't think that would affect the stablecoin itself. The problem, and there's a third level of permission, right? There's the kill switch, and then there is the who gets to hold this thing. Now, if you have a stable coin that has a kill switch, an algorithmic stablecoin that has a kill switch where you could freeze assets, I would argue that at that point it is significantly less useful, because one of the key reasons for an algorithmic stablecoin is to have it be censorship resistant, right? At the very least, for me as a user, the key aspect is that it is censorship resistant. For, I don't know, Maker or whomever, it is that you get to back this thing is not with fiat, but with something else. But that's a distinction there. If we get to the third level of permission, which is that only a few people get to hold this, then I don't really see much use for an algo stablecoin. Might as well be holding EOS at that point. Because when it gets to using a currency, which is the question of who gets to hold it, you want the currency that is the most widely accepted. And a currency where random people get excluded for whatever reason, what use does it have? Why am I using an algo stablecoin with all the added risks that it brings when I could just be holding a purely stable permission stablecoin?
So what do you think is the future of Maker?
I haven't been bullish on Maker in a while. So Maker is one of those projects that has stupid amounts of money, right? They could they could just chug along for who knows how long. I would not be bullish Maker on a situation where, we have all this, where we have all this scrutiny on algo stable coins. And when we have a founder who is openly repeating that we should go dark because governments are bad and going to come for us right now. So I'd say it doesn't seem like a good combination for the project to thrive.
No, and especially if you're starting to sort of diversify your underlying investments into TradFi, you probably don't want to be simultaneously making the maximum amount of enemies in TradFi.
Just don't get that, right? It's not even TradFi. It's like, let's say that you're a threat to banks, right? Like, okay, you're a threat to older banks, fine, but you're a threat to them because of the nature of your business. that act like, I don't know, food delivery apps are a threat to restaurants. But there's a big difference between banks and making enemies with the people who can make what you are doing, your core business, a J-level offense. Right? When you're making enemies with those people, now how exactly is this going to become a booming business?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a bit concerning. I think my take recently has been that I think Maker is in this sort of blurry middle ground where they started really early, right? It's a really old project. And so their whole kind of value system and even value proposition was built for an era when people were convinced that we're going to take over the entire world. Everything is going to be decentralized. No one can stop us, kind of stuff. And now that it's becoming not so, I mean, that vision from the very beginning was quite flawed, mainly because it's so, like, it's not very flexible to the realities, right? Like, what you want to do is you want to improve the system. You don't want to improve the system at any cost. So that doesn't really make sense. And I think so bringing back to kind of the old school mentality, I think one thing that people, me included, underestimated to some degree is governments and financial institutions' willingness to actually get involved with the innovation. So a big part of the mindset in the early days was like, no one will ever sort of voluntarily allow this to happen. And now it actually looks like they do want it to happen. In fact, everyone would likely prefer that we digitalized all this shit, right? Like, as I keep saying in all our calls, the banking infrastructure was made for a time of horses and wagons. And so I do think it's happening. And because it's happening, because they are responding and thinking about how, like, sort of the traditional financial world and governments are thinking about what it would look like to do this from their perspective, it's creating this very strange environment where you have this very like hardcore old school group of people who are like, fuck central banks. We need to burn everything down. And then you have the governments going like, how do we make this sort of on our own terms and thus, unfortunately, a vehicle for mass financial surveillance? And what everyone should be thinking about, in my mind, and this is a Maker was like, Ruin was going in this direction before, until the OFAC stuff happened. He was going in this direction, which is like, there's some middle ground, which is better than either of these extremes. And unfortunately, he went a little bit crazy, I think, with the OFAC sanctioning of Tornado Cash. But yeah, like my point is that there is an actual path to being like regulated and accepted and sort of, and thus also going mainstream, that's visible today, which was not a few years ago. And the big differentiator for projects is going to be, do they take that path and basically change the value system a little bit, or do they go hard on the other direction, which is more, the Pirate Bay route, and the outcome is likely largely the same. And maybe as a final point on this, I'm an advocate for the middle ground, broadly speaking, because I don't want to burn anything down. I also don't want mass financial surveillance. But I think there's for some reason, there's a very strong sort of sense in crypto that any compromise is bad. And I think that's strategically a very poor decision, because that creates a situation where like governments have to calm down hard, as opposed to feeling like there's some sort of negotiation and they can work through it. And I think people on the hardcore side are vastly underestimating how hard the governments can calm down. Like, does that make sense? Like, I like the link you shared from South Korea. What are the South Korean prosecutors trying to do with the BitThumb guy? Was it like 80 million
Oh, well, that,
in fines and jail time?
that was actually, yeah, but it was a significant amount of jail time, but that seems to have been a pretty straightforward case of embezzling for what it's worth. It wasn't like, oh,
Well,
you were
yeah.
just running an exchange. It was this guy went to someone for, I think it was 60 million in investment. And in theory, this would lead to an acquisition. And then he went like, whoops, sorry, all things gone. Bye-bye.
Okay, so it was one of the classic rug pull moves. Okay, that makes more sense. But in any case, like,
Yeah.
Stoquan is maybe a better example of this, where granted it was a spectacular failure and a lot of people lost a lot of money and a lot of people want someone to be responsible, but it's not clear that he was like intentionally doing anything wrong, is it? You're looking at me
Yeah.
as if I'm
Okay.
like talking crazy. What's going on?
Okay. So a couple things there. First of all, it, was he intentionally doing something wrong? I would at the very least say that his behavior in promoting this as something completely bulletproof was at the very least reckless. Now, if
Yeah,
by
but I mean,
wrong you
come
mean
on.
clearly embezzling,
All the founders do that. All the founders except for
oh,
Anatoly and Vitalik.
yes, and if they're being reckless and shit explodes as spectacularly as it did with Yuna, I would expect the hammer to come down as well. It's just that most of the reckless one haven't had the light grenade that they're playing with exploding their faces, right? Now, if you're asking if he did something like legally wrong, then I have no idea. That's a different question. Now, the thing that people seem to keep forgetting, and I have no idea why. Well, I guess I guess the 9/11 was a while ago, so and the USA Patriot Act came a while ago, right? But you mentioned that this thing was a spectacular failure, and most sweeping laws come out of spectacular situations because people don't want to argue about them, right? That's how the USA Patriot Act came about. And they tell you this is just going to be used against terrorists. And it turns out that it is used to prosecute strippers for tax evasion, and it is used by cops to spy on their ex-girlfriends, right? So it does start with the spectacular failures, but it ends up being applied absolutely everybody else, which I think is what the industry is missing. The point that these spectacular failures will lead to not just the dog ones of the world or the Three Arrows Capitals or whatever, right? Getting the banhammer, but even smaller projects. Because once you're a prosecutor who needs to up their numbers for this year, then they're gonna go out and see who they can hit with a hammer. Because that's what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a tricky situation. But I also recognize that there's not an obvious solution, right? Like, if you, like, in terms of trying to come up with the sort of the optimal system that would work for everyone, that's obviously a bit of a utopia, but it's also tricky just because, like, if you can't like just go and ask governments what they want, because they'll tell you, we want CBDC in full control. You can't ask, crypto people what they want, because, they want, to overthrow the government. So how do you kind of iterate on that? It's almost, I think the only way to do it really is to like try to sort of design from first principles, and then, like, over time, as these situations arise, the ones that work the best in that middle ground will hopefully kind of make it, because they'll do enough to appease governments and enough to appease sort of the end users and crypto people.
I have never heard something described as closely as the challenges of actual entrepreneurship. It's the same everywhere, man. It's
Well,
just
yeah, but
it just happens to be that the crypto people are more combative, and because they got to print money out of thin air, therefore they decide that they're geniuses because they're worth billions.
well, well, with a lot of entrepreneurial things, you can go and talk to customers and they'll tell you kind of what they need. And then, yeah, you package it maybe a little bit differently than what they say directly, but ultimately you have that sort of direct feedback loop. Here, you don't really have that except over time because like what you need, like, let's say that we launch a new L1, right? And we incorporate some mechanisms or just dynamics that allow governments to do some things, assuming the network providers agree that there are reasonable things to do. Simple example would be like it's a privacy chain, but some transaction chains can be exposed via like the governance or something like that. That's just an example. The benefit of that like won't be visible for a very long time until a situation actually arises where governments are like, we need to know where this money has gone. And they go to all these different chains and then only one chain is able to show them, right? That's when the benefit of that gets realized. And that's when the government is like, holy shit, like all of these chains could be like this. Why don't we force them to be like this? But who knows when that's going to happen, like, or if it even will happen because
That's not an issue.
the government is just as likely to just go like sanction, Zcash in its entirety, like you don't know you don't know how they're going to approach these situations. And so it's very, very difficult to design something that's sort of optimal for it.
Well, and for as well, Zcash would not fulfill that because Zcash is fully private. So if I want to be private, then there's nothing anybody can do about it. But that's a different case. What you're saying is that it is going to be difficult to cater to governments. I don't think you should cater to governments necessarily. I'm just saying that you need to go ask them what they want in the first place, but try and maybe not antagonize them when you're building something that's small and fragile. And I think that just
Yeah.
because Maker has a couple $1 billion in the bank, they've forgotten how fragile that is, how fragile Maker is, because they're giving this $2 billion to a single company that operates on a jurisdiction that is extremely trigger happy when it comes to freezing money.
Yeah. And they're very like we discussed this in our last episode, right? Like why would you as maker put all your money into entities that are in the same jurisdiction? Like surely the way to do it is to diversify the legal framework under which some of your capital is held. That gives you some protection. It's like what central banks do. But now, like if you give it to Coinbase, first of all, USDC is Circle and Coinbase. Like you're just, I don't know. Okay, you maybe get a yield for it now. That makes sense. Like it does make sense for them to try to get the yield, which currently is being earned by Circles in the back end of USDC. But why all in the same place? Like there's some overhead maybe from doing more places, but surely you could split it into like 4 countries, put some in Switzerland and hope they don't bend over,
Yeah. And on top of that, why did do you know why they did not go with Gemini? Because from what I recall, Gemini's deal was the better one.
No idea. I mean, at some point, I'm sure there's going to be a big expose of a lot of these different deals that have happened. And you know how like the politicians, like when they vote on stuff, there's always someone who like figures out that they're being funded by the oil companies and stuff like that. There's going to be something like this, right? Like you remember with EOS it very quickly became like a cartel and there was like all kinds of corruption. Guaranteed that is happening across all of these networks already if there's enough money at play. It's just not as visible. And at some point, there's going to be some parts of that that become visible, and people are going to be like, oh, that's why they did that.
I mean,
But yeah,
it wouldn't surprise me to see something as straightforward as investors in Maker are investors in Coinbase. So they voted for Coinbase, right? It could simply be something just as simple as that.
well, I don't think anybody is really an investor in Gemini, right? Like, isn't Gemini a largely digital currency group owned? Let's just check.
Okay, let's put it this way. I know the Winklevi are the founders. I don't know who owns it.
Yeah, I guess it's right. It's Winklevoss. So I think most likely, well, first of all, Coinbase is public, so obviously a lot more people hold that stock, and I doubt there's a lot of overlap on investors. So that could be it. That could be it. There is certainly a lot of value in having strategic people owning your stock, right? And Coinbase is a stock that I would, if I was to take a guess, I would assume that the vast majority of serious crypto investors own Coinbase stock now.
I would make a similar.
Did you vote? Did you vote in the Maker thing?
I mean, myself, I'm not holding any Maker.
Oh, okay.
I really haven't been bullish on Maker for a while, and I think it was late 2020 or mid 2021, no, late 2021, when I decided that I needed to hoard my mental bandwidth. So I basically started getting rid of stuff that I wasn't too bullish on or didn't want to spend the mental bandwidth on. This was actually much before we started doing this. If at this point now, who knows, maybe I would still be holding Maker, given that we keep discussing it, because it would feel like I'm keeping up with the news. But I just didn't want to spend the time keeping up with a whole bunch of projects. So I just started dumping things, which got kind of lucky, I gotta say.
Yeah, I mean, I did the same. I was like, I don't have time for this, and it's the bull market. I might as well get out, pretty much. Maybe we should move on to general governance discussions. I hear you have become frustrated with DAO governance.
Well, what gave it away? Nah, it's just not DAO governance as a whole. I do think there's a lot of value in centralization, and I do think that people should get by and large involved on the protocols that they depend on, right? So say if I were using DAI, if I care enough to use DAI, I would be active on Maker governance, even though I would probably own even a rounding error of what ended up voting on this election, right? But I do think people should get involved on that. The tricky thing about governance is that, by and large, as you have mentioned yourself, I think that there's a fair chance that more responsive, faster teams that don't need to go through governance will massively outperform teams that do need to go through governance. This is something that I've been trying to address in Marinade by marking a clear line between the things that the team can decide by itself and the things that the team can decide by itself. So for instance, when we created the grant process and put out a marketing budget, I wanted this to be like self-contained things, which is why I was saying that I am all for small teams deciding quickly, right? So it was like, say the grant team is 3 people, 2 from the team, 1 from the community. They get to decide with things within a certain parameter. They get to decide autonomously, pretty much just 2 out of 3 votes. And they have a budget of 10 million MND, right? It's not that they have a carte blanche. There are some restrictions on this, and the DAO can come in and vote to veto a grant. Say the DAO can interfere.
Yeah.
But by and large, these people can decide independently.
I was going to ask, is there like
Go
a
ahead.
delay? So if those 2 out of 3 people decide to give a grant, is there some period during which then the governance can veto? And what does governance veto looks like? Does it require 80% quorum, or how does that
Yeah,
veto process?
that's one of the things that I find absurd on the current governance discussions. No, first, right now, the requirement that we have is that grants should be discussed in public for at least a week before they get assigned. After the final version, let's say if somebody says like, yeah, this is my final request for a grant, then that needs at the very least a week of public discussion. And then, if I recall correctly, it is maybe 3 days that people have to initiate a veto, or a week or something like that. Anyway, the grants don't get assigned immediately. Grants go out only once whatever the work has been done. So there's even more time to discuss the veto, right? Because it's not like, oh, we approve this thing, here you go, have 1 million MND, have fun. So there's still time until the delivery, let's say, for people to argue this. What veto looks like is basically a regular governance vote, which right now the quorum is 7 million MND. There are, I think, about... In Marinade,
What is 7
governance is a
million?
little bit different because it depends on locked tokens.
What is
That's what I'm going to say.
7
That
million?
I think there are right now about 100. I think there are about 100 million, 110 million locked tokens. So right now, 7 million vote would be 6% of the token vote voting, or the locked token vote voting. So that's kind of like quorum. But again, this varies depending on if people have locked or unlocked and whatnot. And out of those 7 million, the vote could pass by a single, the motion could pass by a single vote, right? If you get, 6,900,000 abstains, people explicitly voting abstain, and then you get the other 100,000 winning by 1, that still passes. So it's just about the quorum. Anyway, we went on a tangent there. The thing that really gets me about governance is that when people spot a governance problem, they go like, oh, this thing here shouldn't have happened. Let's build an elaborate system around it so that thing never happens again. If you look at Hasu's post, it is frankly absurd. He's proposing that constitution changes require 80% quorum, strategy changes 50%, and tactics changes 20%. I think it was. First of all, do you actually expect that a token like Maker, which is widely traded across multiple exchanges, do you expect that only 20% is going to be locked in market making things, and that the rest is going to be just there sitting around waiting to vote on a constitution change? Or that market makers are going to pull their funds out just so they're going to participate here? Like, this is a completely absurd number for a project like Maker. Like even Marinade, where the token is still in relatively few hands because we'd had a fair launch, so it's just the people who have been participating who actually hold the token by and large. So even in Marinade's case, I think that the largest turnout that we have had in a vote was something like 51% of all locked tokens. It usually hovers around 15, 18%.
Yeah.
And this was early on where the token ownership was more concentrated than now, right? Where you probably got a couple of people voting and that's 50%. So, expecting these thresholds is basically say the DAO is never going to do anything. And then you get this fuzzy definitions of what is strategy versus what is tactics, right? At the very least, on the case of the constitution, you could say like, oh, Maker's constitution is these 5 things that we have signed and put on chain. Like, fine, whatever. Like at the very least, you can say if you're going to address one of those 5 things, then we need whatever threshold you want. But strategy versus tactics, like it's going to be so trivial for people to argue like, oh, no, this is not a strategy change. This is just a tactical change for the next 2-3 months that we're just changing our approach. And that's why we should have a lower threshold. And then which system decides unequivocally that this is the threshold that it should go through?
Yeah, well, if that was the case and no one would ever propose a strategy change, everything would be positioned as tactics, right? Because there would be no chance of ever getting a strategy change through. But yeah, so
or even if there was a chance, like suppose that the thresholds were more reasonable, right? Let's take the marinade example. Suppose that in marinade the average turnout is 15%, and then you put tactics at 15, and you put strategy at 30. Even if the threshold is reasonable, why would you suggest a strategy change? It's basically, and if you just focus on tactics, then this just means that you have this really short-term view mentality. You don't have like a project thinking long-term because, I don't want to bother with a vote. It's absurd.
Yeah. I mean, there's not really any solution to this though, is there? Like in the traditional world, there's voter apathy. No one has solved this problem per se. My biggest concern relating to this stuff is that if we have problems this big with fungible tokens, where at least you have some big whales who can move things, like you maybe only need to get, 10 people to vote to get a significant portion or whatever it is. It depends on the project. How is that going to work with NFTs? I was just speaking to a VC friend of mine a little while ago, and he was of the opinion that one token, one vote is probably a good model. And I agree on like a philosophical level, right? Like sort of democracy. It makes sense. It makes sense why. The problem is that where you previously were struggling to get those 10 people to vote, you now have 10,000 people you need to get vote. And I don't see that actually happening. Like maybe in projects that become so foundational to like all this stuff, like if you're one of the underpinnings of the whole economic system, the holders of that may in fact be quite motivated to vote. But if you're an NFT project and all your users hold NFTs from 40 other projects, like how will you get them to vote? It doesn't make sense. And I don't know what the solution is to.
You lower the quorum to something like nothing.
Yeah. I mean that you lower the requirements. I agree, but then you do get this issue of like the desires of the actual community, right? Because you may need to in a lot of projects lower the quorum to like 5% to make constitutional level changes, which is kind of strange. So I don't know, but one question that this brought to my mind is, I wonder, so you mentioned the whole like tokens and market making activities. So there's a lot of tokens in dexes and, whatever exchanges, stuff like that, which are basically not usable for voting. I wonder how that's handled in the traditional world, because they do have the same thing, but I'm sure they do actually utilize those tokens, those shares in voting. So I wonder how they structure it. They probably just have like a Word document or an Excel, which is like, here's the shares we have. And then everyone's like, great, that seems legit.
Yeah. Now, there's also the situation that in the real world, there are different layers of this, right? There's the vast majority of the decisions are not made by shareholders voting, right? The vast majority of decisions are made by the CEO, and then the board leads or pushes the CEO, and if the CEO doesn't work, the board pushes them out. And then maybe you get to something that needs to get ratified by shareholders. There's layers and levels of stuff, which, by the way, is how I've seen some teams try to handle this. It's just that I think that for the vast majority of teams, they just decentralize too early. And then they go on this then they go on this design sprees around the governance, when that is not their focus. That should not be their core business, right? Your core business is not producing governance tools or designing governance frameworks. Focus on the core business, first, deal with this as kind of like a squeaky wheel that eventually will need to get sorted, but it's not an issue right now. With the one NFT, one vote thing, what I've seen, I'm not a Monkey DAO member, but someone who was basically told me that how they solved it, because they had a couple issues. Given that you have, like usually one vote, one NFT, then anybody could make a proposal, no matter how dumb it was, right? So they had a lot of spam proposals because, and this is what complicates things further, I guess, for NFT projects, since they are around a culture. Then this is an extremely fuzzy thing that you can't really necessarily evaluate. And anybody, like 10 different people may have 10 different ideas of culture. Whereas on a business focused project, let's say, or something that should be a business focused project like Marinade, it should be very straightforward what the business is. And then you need to figure out if this proposal is a good way to achieve that business goal. Anyway, what I've seen on the things like Monkey DAO is that they voted to form a council, effectively of holders that get reelected, and they get to make decisions for a while. So kind of like a company or a foundation. Who would have thought? So,
Crazy.
I now see that another team like Orca is kind of like a Uniswap in Solana, is coming up with this, again, council focus framework. But I'm not entirely clear on exactly how the latest version is, because the issue with this is that it seems like just more centralization. Basically, you have 7 people who get to put some proposals, who are the ones who get to put proposals forward, and proposals pass with, I think it is 4 out of 7 votes of these people. So basically you have a DAO where 4 people are making the decisions. And I think, if I recall correctly, there's a certain threshold of token holders that could veto proposals, which, okay, fine, I guess. But at that point, why are you just not making decisions in a centralized way? And usually the answer on these things tends to be, well, because I wanted to issue a token, so we need the token just for something, right?
But this is exactly what I was going to say, is like usually the reason they end up in that situation is because they launched the token first and then they need to like make it seem decentralized and whatnot. It's sort of like, I think you said this, it sort of like tries to be a regulatory shield, but it probably isn't in actuality.
Yeah, and assuming that lawyer that I spoke to is correct, then the legal shield doesn't really help anyway.
Yeah, no. But so the question then is, I think, like, would DAOs be better off basically incorporating a company like structure where token voters basically vote on the board puts in place a CEO, and then so on and so on? Because that, like, there might be improvements on that structure, but that has been kind of incrementally created over time, over a very long period of time, to be sort of the standard way of doing things. And it is faster, much faster than, for example, the way governments are run.
I don't know, man. Frankly, I think I'm still unsure what is the correct path forward. I'm by and large leaning towards thinking that these two are orthogonal things. If a DAO is going to incorporate as is going to have like this fake business structure, like so you define a board and then you get to vote the board out, etc. You're still not getting you're getting a lot of the disadvantages of having a company without the advantages of having one. Like what we discussed about when Maker puts their money into Coinbase, who signs that contract? Who is the treasury giving $2 billion to, who then gets to go to Coinbase and say like, hey, I have this contract signed with Coinbase and I would like to withdraw my $2 billion. right? There's going to be a need for some real world institution in there handling these things. I currently think that these two things should be separate. Basically, I'm leaning towards the AAVE model where you have the DAO and you have AAVE Labs, and these are completely separate things, being the right one. Because in this approach, the DAO still gets to control the protocol. They still get to define if they want this piece of code to go into the code base or not, right? But you, as a builder, you do not necessarily need to go to the DAO before you build it. You could just fund it yourself and say like, hey, there's this piece of code that we want to merge. This is what it does. This is how we think we should be compensated for that piece of code, right? Which could be a completely new version of the platform. It could just be a new feature or what have you. And then you have it in that way. And also at that point, the company in theory becomes a replaceable part. It doesn't become this, group of community members only that happen like where everybody's equal, only some are more equal than others. It is in theory a part that the DAO can replace if this company starts behaving against their wishes, which is something that's a lot fussier on most DAOs that I have seen.
So on that topic, so I'm concerned about the self-funding part of it, right? Like so AAVE Labs does have an incentive to self-fund these things because they have money to do it. And, they basically know that whatever they build is going to be accepted. I don't think that applies to most other things. Like running an organization that way would be quite tricky. The way you would have to do it is you would have to have like explicit bounties for doing certain things that are large enough to sort of justify taking financial risk to build it before you get paid. And so you would almost need to have like the bounties be big enough where you could go off and raise VC money to do it, to then hopefully get the bounty or something like that. So I'm not completely sure that works. Like most things get built, they need funding, right? Like, and it doesn't come from just some random place when then you hope that the DAO will pay for it.
And most of these DAOs that we're discussing are actually companies that raised a stupid amount of capital, right? Like Marinate's case, where it has actually been bootstrapped with grants, like Marinate's case is an exception. By and large, we have founders who raise millions and on top of that, keep a significant percentage of their token supply. And if they wanted to fund it, they could just, use whatever they raised as VC capital for that, right? So it's not like we're talking bootstrap startups by and large in here, right?
Yeah. So they're not bootstrap startups. I'm talking about like other companies getting involved in that model, right? So if your model is that you have this DAO and they basically like pay other companies come to them, like, we built this thing, can you do this? I don't think that works because people need money to do things. And so the way that most DAOs have gone about it, the AAVE case is a bit different because it's the company. It's like Parity and Polkadot. Like there's so much overlap that they can afford to do that kind of thing. But if you go to a DAO, generally you ask for funding to build something and then you get a small initial grant and then a larger grant and whatever, like to do it. And that's fine, right? Like there's ways of doing that. What I'm concerned about is that still doesn't solve the actual governance issue in terms of operating that. Like if the DAO's only function is to fund teams to do stuff, that's fine, but you still need those operational people. And that operation structure probably maybe looks kind of like a company in itself, right?
It does. But again, we're talking about probably like if we look at the MakerDAO vote again, a large vote concentration. So if the issue is, are people going to vote to approve auto contributions? If it benefits them, like why wouldn't they? Because they already have all these investors and the founders have a gigantic chunk with which to make sure that these things pass, right? I don't necessarily think that that needs extra structure. There already is a de facto board. It is the people controlling 30-40% of the supply anyway. They just need to stop pretending that they're, equal party community members or anything.
Well, I'm gonna make a prediction. I think eventually these DAOs are gonna be just companies, and they will need to abide by a modified legal rule set that is not that different from how companies are structured right now. It's going to take a long time. And but right now, this idea that we can create companies, but just not have any legal entity, you don't get any of the legal protections either. I don't think that's going to fly long term. Like the government's main question relating to DAOs, as far as I've been reading the commentary, is basically like, aren't these just companies that are not legally set up? Like, and it's like, wow, yes. Like, if there, and the other question relating to that is like, is there actually a benefit to permissionlessness in that context? And I think there is, in terms of reducing overhead. Like, you can have companies with directors from all over the world and stuff. It's just legally very complicated. And the legal structure is very poorly set up for that. It's very poorly set up to even employ people globally. Like we work, or we have people at Equilibrium in, like, I don't know, 15 different countries. And the standard rule set for that is like everyone, like we would theoretically need to have like a company in each of these countries to do this stuff, or use some staffing providers or whatever. It's very complicated. And so if that was streamlined to work better in a more globalized world, then I don't think you would actually lose out on much of the benefits of permissionlessness, even if it was sort of a formal legal structure that then also allowed you to like have a bank account and stuff. Like things that are relatively useful in the real world.
Yeah, there are two aspects to permissionlessness, right? Or a few that are important. One of them is, can they shut this down? Right. I think that the OFAC sanctions and combined with the gigantic stake concentration that we're seeing basically have devalued a lot the you cannot shut down aspect of things. If a particular smart contract gets sanctioned by the US government, chances are that a lot of centralized transaction bundlers are going to stop taking transactions for that contract. So that's going to devalue that a lot. Permissionless still has the advantage for people who are not living in your ideal European right respecting jurisdiction, right? The fact that people still get to contribute while being paid in money that they get to hold themselves, and that they don't need to go to, I don't know, a bank to see if they're going to be able to withdraw or something, except maybe, at some point that they need to turn it to fiat, but they get to do this. They get to spread out their risk, basically. The fact that people get to do that still is a win for permissionlessness.
Yeah. So I'll clarify that point. I'm not arguing so much about permissionless in that way. I'm saying like, maybe the way to do DAOs ultimately is actually one where there is a legal structure, and the legal structure is just codified into a DAO, basically. That doesn't actually remove anyone's like autonomy in the system. So it's still permissionless in that sense. It's just that the legal framework, for example, like you need to have these roles filled, for example, you need a board, things like that, whatever it is that in that jurisdiction or requirements, those are codified into a DAO, right? And then the DAO is just a way of enacting the legal structure. And so that's kind of, that's more what I mean. It's not it's what I mean by sort of permissioned in this case is more that once you start codifying the traditional legal structure, you do need to abide by the restrictions therein, which oftentimes are, for example, you can't have a director from like North Korea, like those kinds of things. It won't be completely permissionless in that sense, because there are these factions in the world that don't want the other factions to participate in their thing. That doesn't mean that you actually build in anything permission per se. It's just that the operating, like the way it's operated doesn't sort of allow certain individuals to be in certain kinds of roles. And quite possibly then from the, like sort of if the token is considered stock, etc., then also there are restrictions on who can hold that stock, as there are in the traditional world.
Here's how I see it, actually. I don't think we need a board. I don't think I need those lines, etc. I think basically that the DAO should limit itself to controlling protocol parameters and deciding if a piece of code is supposed to go into the protocol or not. That's pretty much it. Anything other than that should be companies, foundations, whatever else you want to structure that is a real world thing. And then you do need to get into things of, can you, as Equilibrium, who's contributing to this particular DAO, work with some people or not? But at the very least, that encapsulates the thing. Because the trickier part that I see on most DAOs is that, I'm leaving aside things like, for instance, synthetics that did have a very mature approach to decentralization, even if a little bit over-engineered for most projects. But basically, the key thing with most DAOs is that people vote on proposals that pass, and maybe they vote on assigning funds from the treasury. But end of the day, the contract upgrade authority tends to be in a very limited hands. And the point that I was making yesterday is that those who vote decide nothing. Those who actually decide on implementation proposals and on what ends up on chain decide everything. So you might as well acknowledge that and focus the DAO efforts on, the DAO and governance efforts on corralling that part and corralling the protocol parameters, and have everything else be independent, well-structured companies that get to operate as a proper company. So that's what I think is that is, as you were talking middle grounds, that is my middle path.
Right. Okay. So I see what you mean. If we take the MakerDAO case, it would basically be screw these meta DAOs. Let's just incorporate them as companies and fund them from the treasury.
Exactly. So small technical difficulties, but we're back. The last thing you were saying after my small rant about maker and companies, if I heard you correctly, because it was also stuttering a bit, was that you asked me to confirm if what I thought would be the right approach would be basically that all this top DAOs would be basically small companies that get funded with treasury outlays from maker. Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And that is exactly it. I think if you want to go for something like the sub-DAO thing, that's how I would do it. Again, you just focus the DAO side of things on the protocol parameters, the treasury management, and the rest you just operate as actual businesses independently. That might be harder if one of this is just 3 people, and one of them is in Cambodia, the other one in Finland, and the third one in Panama, right? So you may end up having to have like an umbrella contract with something like Deal or whatever. Who knows? But I do think that is the cleanest approach for most things that I've seen turn themselves into a DAO, particularly when they're usually a company with a token attached. They just don't want to see it that way.
Yeah. And adding more tokens is, I think, kind of a risky endeavor in that context, because you're creating entities that look even more like companies while saying they're not. Yeah, and so that's always a bit sketchy. Maybe we should move on to the last thing. You wanted to discuss the staking pools. I hear you're concerned about centralization risk on that front.
Oh God, that's one. I'm sure there's much to discuss on that. So, okay, this is one that we're going to need to discuss in more time that my phone has battery, which is the one that I'm using as a camera.
It is a very interesting topic, and it's one which I'm very interested to hear more of the Solana side of things. I've had a conversation on Twitter with Anatoly about this. And just as a random controversial comment, there's sort of this perception that there's less MAV possible on Solana, which I think is complete horseshit. So let's talk about that next time. And for now, we'll wrap it up. And next time, we'll also probably be back with our previous recording infrastructure, since this experiment has failed miserably.
Yeah, but Riverside has not sold us so far.
No.
I don't think that there's less MEV possible on Solana. Maybe that just comes from the fact that right now there's less MEV happening on Solana. That because of how the network is structured, and nobody has just really bothered to do it by and large, except a couple teams. So maybe that's where that perception comes from.
Yeah. Any case, let's wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in a few weeks.